Have you ever wondered why we forget? Or what are some of the reasons why forgetting happens? Like, especially when you're young. I mean, when you get old, you understand, right? But when you're young, when you forget stuff, where did I leave my car? Like, why did I get to this room? I just don't remember. Or what was I talking about? These are some things that we often have caught ourselves doing, and we don't really know what makes it hard for us to remember stuff. When it comes to exams, it's easy to know how forgetting actually happens because you probably thought you remembered it, but when you're writing the exam is when you don't um, you come to the realization that it's not just something that you remember. So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about what factors influence forgetting. Edemontis is one of those who actually first came up with different ways in which we can understand how the forgetting happens, like especially in terms of curve. If you imagine it that way, it makes more sense. Uh, Reading it for the first time may be the hardest one, but according to studies, if you read over and over again and repeat it, the relearning part is more easier, and it's easy to when you connect meaning to it for you to remember it. So, in what ways can forgetting be adaptable? If you think about it, yes, forgetting could be um, a helpful process when we need to forget something that's painful, a painful experience, or when we are wanting to store information that is new and we don't want older informations to be in the way, when we don't need to retain all the information that are probably not so important. Yes, forgetting is so important process. Then there are different theories that kind of explain why forgetting happens, and we're just going to go over these really quickly in this video. So the first one, decay. Like any other mechanism, if you do not use it, you lose it. So it's very important for us to understand how our brain functions, especially when you do have neural connections that are too many as you grow up until 6 years, and when there are no, the strength of the neurons actually decay or they reduce in their strength if they are not fired often, which means they deteriorate over time if not used. So the other one is an interference. So if pretend you're taking a psychology test, but just before taking a psychology test, remember, think if you were studying so hard the previous night for a history test, which is a newer memory than the last 2 weeks before when you actually studied for this psychology test. If you, while taking the psychology test, if you just remember things that you actually read for the in this history class the last night, and if it's in coming in the way of recalling the information from the psychology class that you had 2 weeks ago, that is called retroactive interference. There is another which calls proactive interference, which is if the older information is interfering with the newer information. So in this case, if psychology test is newer, which was last night, and you're taking a test, but all that comes to your mind is the history test that you actually studied for, if those memories are coming up, it's called proactive interference. When you have competing memory, it's called interference. All right, the other one is motivated forgetting, which is on purpose, which Freud talks about, is when there is something unpleasant or anxiety providing information, we consciously, unconsciously try to repress that emotions or repress that feeling, and that becomes motivated forgetting. And if, because motivation, the memory is a process of that involves encoding and involves retrieval, when there is a flaw in the process or in the flow of information right from the encoding part, there could be a failure to remember. So, this is an example I speak about in the previous video, which is if at all you have certain, like, if you have not really thought about how a penny looks, if that information was not something that was pertaining to you, you probably would be finding it hard to know which of this is the right one, which in this case is A. But it's very seldom that people actually pay attention to what's on a penny to know that, because that probably was not important information for them. Right, so as I said, encoding is where the process begins, and retrieval is where you actually put the memory material into use. So if it's there, but you are not able to access it, not really available, like, we say tip of the tongue. I mean, I know it's in the tip of the tongue. Well, you know it's there, you know it, but you're not able to say it. Well, in that case, that is also one of the issues relating to forgetting. Right? So there are different factors that influence forgetting. Like, if you're trying to tell a story over and over again, every time you're not going to tell the same story in the same way. You're going to alter that or reconstruct it every time you retrieve it. So which is called the misinformation effect. The other phenomenon is understanding about while we recall, well, how do we tend to what do we tend to remember often? So see if you can do this really quickly with me. Take a piece of paper and see if you can write down the names of presidents. And while you're trying to do that, see if you're able to get all these names in an order. So when I usually ask my class students to do this, most of them would get the most first few and the last few. I know Trump is not yet on this list, but people would get all the, at least from Bush. I have students recall and from the beginning, but not someone in between. So this kind of explains a phenomenon called as um, uh, well, it explains the primacy serial positioning effect, which is what we'll talk about in a second. But I want you all to do one more thing. I want you to look at this list of words, and I want you to remember these words and write it in just a few minutes. All right, now I'm going to take this away and I want you to write it. See how much you can recall. If you want to pause the video, you can do that and try and see if you can recall the words. So once you have done recalling the words, I want you to tell me if you were able to recall a certain word like sleep or doctor. Well, don't worry if you did not remember to have those words. That's fine. Did you have the word sour and the word cake? Well, if you did, that tells you that you were getting in the phenomenon of sour was the first word and cake was the last word. And then there's another one. So that kind of explains serial position effect, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other one is artichoke. Did you have that? Well, most of you would, because it's distinct. So when things are like distinct, we tend to remember it. Honey, yes, there were 2 times repeated, so when repetition helps us to remember something. Did you have the word sweet? Well, 90% of times my class always comes up with this word that's actually very convincingly should be on the list, but it's not. So if you look at this, there is no, sweet is not there on the list, but people really get convinced that it should be, because all of these words kind of relate to that, right? But it does not appear on the list, but we write it anyway. This kind of helps us talk about what's called memory distortion that we will talk about in the next video. All right. So serial position effect is kind of be remembering the information at the beginning. It's easy to recall, and information at the end. It's easy to recall. So that's serial positioning effect. The other one is about amnesia. So I want to talk about like how amnesia does have an impact, but we'll get more into it in the next video. A little bit of idea over culture, over generations in different cultures. We pass our memory in the form of stories to one culture, one generation to the other. So just think of these kind of ideas of what it means to have pass such information from culture, one generation to the other, from people, and how are these, what are the implications of this? Does it strengthen or weaken people in terms of their memory from when it is passed from culture to culture? Few things to think about. So what if we have to review, we just speak a little bit about why we forget and what are certain factors. that contribute to forgetting. And there are a few other videos that follow, which will talk about biology of memory and what are memory distortions.